From the outside, it might have looked like I had everything going for me, a solid job, a decent apartment, and a family who should have been proud of me. But the reality was different. It wasn't what I had, but what I didn't respect. I wasn't the golden child in my family. That title was reserved for my older brother, Ryan. He had it all, a high-paying job, a stunning wife, and the admiration of our parents. Meanwhile, I was the one who dropped out of law school. I never lived up to their expectations, and that reality gnawed at me. Each family gathering was a reminder of how much I had disappointed them. For years, I held my tongue. The jabs were always subtle, but they stung. My mom, with her endless comparisons, and my dad, who never missed an opportunity to remind me how much I had underachieved. And Ryan? Well, he had mastered the art of subtle ridicule, making sure everyone knew that I was the one who couldn't cut it. They never intended to be cruel, or at least they didn't think they were. But the impact was the same. I had learned to smile through it all, pretending it didn't bother me, even though it did. Then came the year-end family reunion, an event that I had come to dread. It was always the same drill, casual talk about Ryan's success, my failure, and everyone else's accomplishments in between. By now, I had become the family's disappointment, the one who was always the butt of their jokes. But this time, it was different. I had decided that I would no longer be their joke. No longer would I sit quietly, swallowing their criticisms and their backhanded compliments. I had made a vow to myself: when the time came, I would get my revenge. It wouldn't be immediate, and it wouldn't be violent, but it would be something they couldn't ignore. This plan would take time, and patience. I had to wait for the perfect moment. A moment where I could strike without them ever seeing it coming. And that moment arrived during one of our usual, mind-numbingly long family dinners. I had been sitting there for what felt like hours, listening to my parents gush about Ryan's recent promotion. Every word was a reminder of how far behind I was. My stomach churned as they complimented him yet again for his supposed hard work, as though I didn't work just as hard, if not harder, in my own job. And there it was again, the look. That look that said it all: Jake just didn't measure up. But this time, I was ready. Instead of biting my tongue as I had done for years, I leaned in slightly, letting my voice drop just enough for everyone at the table to hear. "You know, it's funny," I began, the words coming out smoothly, like a well-rehearsed line, "how people think they can keep a perfect image for so long." Ryan raised an eyebrow, momentarily distracted from his self-congratulation. "Oh?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Yeah, well, I guess it's not so perfect when you have a relative who's involved in some shady business dealings, is it?" The room went dead silent. My parents' faces went pale as they realized exactly what I had just implied. Ryan's expression shifted from one of smugness to one of confusion and then to something that looked like fear. He opened his mouth to protest, but the damage had already been done. My plan was simple. I had discovered, through some careful digging, that my cousin, Michael, had been involved in some questionable financial dealings for years. It wasn't anything that would land him in jail, but it was enough to bring shame to the family. And I knew that once the story was out, the perfect image they had so carefully built would crumble. The fallout didn't take long. Ryan tried to laugh it off, but the damage was already done. It was as though the very foundation of our family's perfect life had been cracked. My parents started whispering, their eyes darting nervously to each other as the weight of my words sunk in. Ryan, who had always been the shining star, suddenly looked vulnerable, his usual confidence replaced with a growing sense of unease. And just like that, my family's perfect little world had begun to unravel, all thanks to a well-placed comment. The satisfaction I felt wasn't from the destruction itself, it was from knowing that, for once, I was the one who had control. I had finally turned the tables. My years of biting my tongue, of enduring their criticisms, had led to this moment. It was a victory, a small but significant one. But this was just the beginning. My plan had always been bigger than a single dinner table revelation. I had a long game to play, and this was just the first move. The weeks that followed were nothing short of exhilarating for me. The news about Michael's shady dealing spread like wildfire through the family, and despite their attempts to sweep it under the rug, the cracks in their perfect image began to show. My parents, who had always prided themselves on their immaculate reputation, suddenly found themselves in damage control mode. Their once proud, perfect family portrait was now tarnished. Ryan tried to act like nothing had changed, but I could see the way his confident smile faltered when he thought no one was looking. Every time someone mentioned the family scandal, he would tense, his mouth pulling into a thin line, as if trying to suppress the anger he no longer bothered to hide. And my parents? They were no longer the invincible pillars of our family. The cracks in their authority were showing, and for the first time in years, I saw the vulnerability that had been so carefully concealed. But as satisfying as it was to watch them squirm, I knew this was only the beginning. They were still too proud, too protective of their image to let this truly derail their perfect little world. I had to make them see that the damage was far from over, that their perfect lives were hanging by a thread, and I was the one holding the scissors. The next step in my plan came when I found out that my father had been quietly making moves to protect the family's financial interests. Nothing illegal, but enough to tip the scales in his favor if things went south. He had always been the one to take control of every situation, to protect our family's reputation at any cost. But in his attempt to safeguard everything, he had overlooked one thing: me. I wasn't just the family's disappointment anymore. I was the one who had the power to expose them for what they truly were. For all their talk of integrity and respectability, I knew better now. I had watched them manipulate situations to their advantage for years, always pretending to be the perfect family, the perfect couple. But it was all a lie. One evening, I decided it was time to hit them where it would hurt the most. I had uncovered something that would add a layer of finality to their downfall, a small, but incredibly important detail about my father's finances. He had been hiding a substantial amount of money in an offshore account, a legacy he planned to pass on to Ryan, likely to ensure that his golden child remained just that. This was the kind of thing that could shatter the illusion of their integrity. And I knew just how to make sure they would never be able to deny it. The timing had to be perfect, of course. I couldn't let them know it was me pulling the strings behind the curtain. I had to wait for the right moment, one that would leave them utterly blindsided. And the perfect opportunity arrived when my family gathered for a holiday dinner at my parents' house, just a few weeks after the first incident. The air was thick with tension, everyone still whispering about Michael's dealings and the way it had tarnished our family's reputation. As we all sat around the dinner table, picking at our food in an uncomfortable silence, I casually dropped another bombshell. "You know," I began, my voice carefully composed, "it's interesting how people think they can hide things from everyone. Take Dad's offshore account, for instance. I mean, it's not exactly hard to uncover, especially with all those financial reports you've been so meticulous about keeping private." Ryan froze mid-bite. His fork clattered against the plate as his eyes locked onto mine, his face pale. My mother looked as though she might faint, her hand trembling as she reached for her wine glass. My father, the rock of our family, suddenly looked like a man who had been caught in a lie too big to deny. You've been looking through my files?" my father asked, his voice sharp and accusing, his jaw clenched in a way I'd never seen before. "I don't need to look through your files, Dad," I said calmly, savoring the moment. "It's all in the open now, isn't it? Just a simple search and it all comes out. Isn't that the funny thing about secrets? They always have a way of coming to light, no matter how well you try to bury them." Ryan shot up from his seat, his face flushed with anger. "What the hell is wrong with you, Jake? Why do you have to ruin everything?" His words were sharp, desperate, but there was nothing he could say to make me feel anything but satisfaction. I looked at him and smiled, savoring the way the tables had turned. For once, the scrutiny wasn't on me. It was on them. And it felt good, too good. The room was thick with tension now. My parents were no longer the composed, well-put-together couple they had always been. My mother, who once had the power to control the narrative, looked utterly defeated. My father, who had once carried himself with a quiet authority, now seemed small in his own home. "I don't know what you think you're doing, Jake," my mother said, her voice wavering. "But this isn't going to end well for you." I tilted my head, raising an eyebrow as I leaned back in my chair. "Oh, I think it already has. They tried to cover it up, of course. Denial, threats, and even tears were used to salvage what little pride they had left. But the damage was done. The family I had spent years trying to please, the family that had belittled me at every turn, was now the one in crisis. Their perfect image had been shattered. And I was the one holding the hammer. But as satisfying as it was to watch their panic unfold, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The game was still far from over, and I wasn't done yet. I would continue to play the long game, watching as my family's carefully curated life fell apart piece by piece, until they finally understood what it felt like to be betrayed. The following weeks were like a slow-motion train wreck. The revelation about my father's offshore account spread through the family like wildfire, but not in the way I had expected. They tried their best to downplay it, of course. Denials, half-truths, and red herrings. But the more they tried to spin the story, the more desperate and transparent they became. Each new attempt to cover their tracks only dug them deeper into the hole they had already created. Ryan, who had been my parents' golden child, suddenly found himself caught in the crossfire. The whispers behind his back became louder, the smiles more strained. My mother, who had always been the one to control the family narrative, was now scrambling, desperately trying to contain the fallout. My father, ever the stoic figure, seemed to age a little more each day. He couldn't keep up with the constant pressure to maintain the family's pristine image, especially when that image was crumbling faster than he could fix it. But it was the quiet moments that were the most revealing. When the family would gather for dinner, there was an unspoken tension in the air. No one knew what to say. My parents were on edge, always glancing at each other, trying to find a way out of the mess. Ryan, who had once spoken with such confidence, now stammered through conversations, his voice cracking whenever anyone brought up the subject of money, family, or integrity. They were no longer the proud, perfect family they had once presented to the world. They were just, human. Flawed. Vulnerable. And for once, I felt no guilt. Not even a shred of it. They had spent years making me feel inferior, as if my mistakes were somehow a reflection of my entire existence. But now, they were the ones struggling to maintain their image, their carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. And I was the one who had made it happen. It was at one of these gatherings, just a month after the family dinner that had set everything in motion, that I saw the cracks begin to widen even further. My mother had invited us all over for what she called a reconciliation dinner, a desperate attempt to put everything back together, to restore some semblance of the family they had once been. The table was set, the food was laid out, and my mother was doing her best to pretend that everything was fine. But as we sat down to eat, I noticed that the mood had shifted. My father, usually the center of attention, was eerily silent. Ryan's usual arrogance had been replaced by a nervous energy, and my mother, always the picture of control, was desperately trying to keep up appearances. There was an air of forced politeness, as if everyone was afraid to speak the truth. It was in this atmosphere of carefully controlled tension that I made my move. I had been holding onto a piece of information for weeks, something small, but significant, another piece of the puzzle that could send their world into chaos. It was about Ryan. A small business venture of his that had been quietly failing. Something that could be covered up by their wealth and reputation, but something that, when exposed, would destroy his image as the successful, perfect son. I didn't say anything immediately. Instead, I waited. I watched as they all tried to pretend that nothing had changed. But they couldn't keep up the act forever. The cracks were starting to show, and I was more than happy to push them further. Finally, after the awkward silence had stretched on for what felt like an eternity, I leaned back in my chair and casually said, "You know, it's funny. I've been hearing some interesting things about Ryan's little business project. I didn't realize it had fallen so far behind. Kind of hard to maintain the perfect image when things aren't going so well, huh?" My mother's fork clattered onto her plate, her eyes going wide with shock. Ryan's face turned red, his mouth opening and closing in a futile attempt to speak. My father's gaze darkened, his clenched jaw a clear sign that he was about to explode. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Ryan stammered, That's not true, Jake. You've got it all wrong." I looked at him, the calmness of my tone betraying the satisfaction I felt. "Oh. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, then. Funny how no one's been able to hide those financial reports you've been cooking the books on, though. You know, the ones showing how much money you've been funneling into that sinking venture. Really makes me wonder what else you've been hiding." The room went silent again, but this time, it was different. My parents were no longer the authoritative figures they had once been. They were just people, exposed and flawed. The veneer of their perfect life had been shattered, and there was no going back. Ryan was visibly shaking now, his pride shattered. My father, who had spent his entire life cultivating the image of a successful, well-put-together family, was now trapped in a corner. There was no way out for him, no way to repair the damage I had caused. And my mother, who had always been the one to keep everything in line, now looked like a woman who had lost control of everything she had worked so hard to build. But I wasn't done yet. There was still one last piece of the puzzle to put in place, one final revelation that would truly make them realize the depth of their mistake. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about proving that their actions had consequences, that they couldn't just keep playing the role of the perfect family without facing the truth. I excused myself from the table, feeling the eyes of my family burning into me. But I didn't care. This was my moment, and I was savoring every second of it. My plan was working perfectly, and there was nothing they could do to stop it now. As I walked out the door, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They had underestimated me for years, but now they were learning the hard way that I was no longer the one to be overlooked. The game had changed. And I was in control. It had been 2 weeks since the family dinner, and the fallout was still rippling through the family. My parents were trying to salvage what little dignity they had left, but I could see the strain. They couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't act like everything was fine. Every time my father walked into a room, the air shifted. He was no longer the confident patriarch who commanded respect, he was just a man, weighed down by the truth. Ryan, who had once been the golden child, now found himself in the hot seat, facing the consequences of his carefully crafted image. I had played my part, but the satisfaction of watching them squirm wasn't enough. I needed more. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about ensuring they understood the magnitude of their actions, the weight of the years they had spent belittling me, trying to mold me into something I wasn't. My plan had always been to expose the layers of their perfect life, bit by bit, until they had nothing left to protect. But there was one last card to play, one final revelation that would make them see the true extent of my resolve. Ryan had always been the family's star, the one who got all the praise, all the accolades. But now, he was in freefall. The financial failure I had exposed was just the beginning. He had no choice but to admit his mistakes. The secret I had uncovered about his business venture was out, and with it, the facade of perfection he had worked so hard to maintain began to crumble. I had known about the venture for months, the cracks in Ryan's empire were too large to ignore. But it wasn't until I found out about his personal dealings, his shady financial investments, that I knew I had something truly explosive. Ryan wasn't just a failure in business, he had been lying to everyone, hiding his mistakes, and using our family's wealth to try and cover up his missteps. It was time to expose him for the fraud he truly was. The next family gathering was already looming on the horizon. My parents, desperate to keep up appearances, had insisted we all come together again. This time, they hoped that things could go back to normal. They were wrong. I wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. As the dinner progressed, I watched their forced smiles, their attempts to ignore the tension that still clung to the air. I could see the way Ryan avoided eye contact, the way my parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, I stood up. The room fell silent, every eye turning to me. I had their attention now. "You know, it's funny," I began, my voice calm, but my words carrying weight. "For years, you've all treated me like I was the problem. Like my mistakes, my failures, were a reflection of who I am. But now, look at you. The perfect family. It's all falling apart, isn't it?" Ryan's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words failed him. My parents sat frozen, their eyes darting between each other, knowing what was coming. "It's funny," I continued, "how some things can be hidden for so long, and how easily they can come to light. Like Ryan's little business venture, for example. The one that he's been trying to salvage with our family's money. Funny how he thought no one would notice, huh?" The silence in the room was deafening. My father looked as though he had been struck, the color draining from his face. Ryan's lips quivered as he tried to form words, but his voice was shaky. "This isn't how you think it is," Ryan said, his voice faltering. "You're making it worse." I looked at him with a mix of pity and contempt. "Oh, I'm not making it worse, Ryan. You did that all on your own. But don't worry, I'm sure you'll find a way to fix it. After all, you've always been good at pretending, haven't you?" My mother, unable to sit in silence any longer, spoke up, her voice tight with anger. "Jake, you've gone too far. This isn't the way to handle things." I turned to her, my eyes cold. "No, Mom. What's going too far is the way you and Dad have treated me my entire life. What's going too far is the way you've made me feel worthless, like my mistakes are something to be ashamed of. But you know what? Maybe I'm not the one with the problem. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's all of you." My words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. There was no turning back now. I had exposed them for what they were. My family, the ones who had always belittled me, were now on the defensive. The perfect image they had so carefully cultivated was shattering before their eyes. Ryan's face twisted with frustration. "You don't get it, Jake. You think this is some kind of game. You think you can just ruin everything, but you're wrong. You're only making things worse for yourself." I stood my ground, feeling an eerie sense of calm wash over me. "I'm not the one who's been lying to everyone, Ryan. I'm not the one who's been hiding the truth for years. I'm just the one who's finally willing to face it." For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of the truth settled heavily over the room, suffocating them, and for the first time, I saw them for what they truly were, vulnerable, broken, and exposed. Then, just as quickly as the silence had come, it was shattered. My mother stood up, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and desperation. "You're tearing this family apart, Jake. You're destroying everything we've worked for." I met her gaze, unflinching. "Maybe everything you've worked for was a lie. And maybe that's why it's all falling apart. You can't build an empire on lies and expect it to last forever." My father, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice low and full of regret. "We did the best we could, Jake. We tried to give you everything we thought you needed. You gave me everything but the one thing that mattered," I said, my voice hardening. "Respect." The room was silent again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was satisfying. The truth had finally come out, and they couldn't deny it anymore. They had spent years hiding behind their perfect image, pretending that everything was fine, but now the mask had fallen. And there was no going back. Ryan's shoulders slumped, and my parents looked like they had aged a decade in just a few minutes. I didn't feel pity for them, though. Not anymore. They had made their bed, and now they had to lie in it. As I turned to leave the room, I knew one thing for sure: the perfect family they had worked so hard to create was gone. And I had been the one to tear it apart. It had been a few days since the final confrontation, and I could already feel the effects of the family upheaval settling in. The silence between my parents and me was deafening. It was as if a gulf had formed between us that couldn't be bridged, not by words, nor by apologies, nor by any attempt at reconciliation. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the constant pressure to be someone I wasn't, free from the toxic expectations that had weighed me down for far too long. And I could feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had finally taken control. But the freedom was also accompanied by a strange emptiness. After all, for years I had been playing their game. I had been doing everything I could to please them, to live up to their standards. I had sacrificed parts of myself just to keep the peace, just to avoid their disdain. And now, with that world shattered, I was left to pick up the pieces. It felt like standing in the wreckage of something I had fought for, something that had never really been mine to begin with. Still, there was no going back. The damage had been done, and there was a part of me that reveled in it. They had finally seen me for who I was, not their failure, not their disappointment, but a person who had been pushed to the edge and had finally found a way to break free. And with that freedom came something even more precious: my self-respect. I spent the next few days in a haze of contemplation, my mind replaying the events over and over again. Each conversation, each carefully timed revelation, each moment of raw satisfaction, everything was unfolding just as I had planned. But there was something else gnawing at me. Something I hadn't anticipated. Ryan, my once proud older brother, had started reaching out. At first, it was just a text message. Simple. "We need to talk." That was all. I didn't respond right away. The truth was, I didn't really want to talk to him. Not yet. He was the one who had spent years mocking me, belittling me for every misstep I made. He had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. And now, suddenly, he was looking for a way to make things right? I wasn't sure I was ready for that conversation. But then came the phone call. "Jake," Ryan's voice was different this time, softer, almost pleading. "I know things have been bad. But I need to tell you something. It's about everything that's been happening." I waited, letting the silence drag on. "I screwed up," he continued, his words heavy with guilt. "Not just with the business, but with you. I never understood what you were going through, and I should have been there for you. I'm sorry." I was surprised by the admission. But I didn't let it show. I had played my hand perfectly, and now he was the one who had to face the consequences. The satisfaction of his apology would have been sweet, but I wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. I needed him to sit in the discomfort of his actions, just as I had been forced to do for years. "Sorry doesn't fix everything, Ryan," I replied, my voice cold. "Sorry doesn't take away the years you spent looking down on me. Sorry doesn't undo all the times you made me feel like I was worthless, like I would never measure up to you. It's too late for that." There was a long pause. I could almost hear him swallowing his frustration on the other end of the line. "I get it, Jake. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I hope we can start over, at least. I don't want to lose you." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I let myself feel a flicker of hope. The possibility of reconciliation. But just as quickly, the flicker died. I had spent too many years being disappointed by people who promised change but never delivered. And I wasn't about to let Ryan off the hook simply because he was finally coming around. "I'm not sure that's something I want," I said, my voice firm. You've had your chance, Ryan. And right now, I'm not interested in rebuilding anything with you. Not after everything you've done. I hung up without waiting for his response. The truth was, I wasn't sure what I wanted. But I knew one thing, I couldn't go back to the way things had been. I had built something new in the wreckage of my family's destruction. Something more honest, something that didn't rely on pretending. That night, I sat on my couch in the dim light of my apartment, reflecting on how far I had come. I had taken the long road to get here. But now, I was free. And no matter what happened with my family from this point forward, I knew that I would never allow them to control my life again. But I still wasn't done. The satisfaction of watching them squirm, of exposing their lies, had been sweet. But there was one final, bitter truth that I had yet to confront. The one thing I had been avoiding. The person I had hurt the most during this entire ordeal, myself. I had spent so many years letting their opinions define me, letting their cruelty shape my sense of worth. In the process, I had lost sight of who I really was. I had been playing their game, their rules, for so long that I had forgotten to play my own. And now, with my family in tatters, I had to find a way to heal. To rebuild myself from the inside out. I didn't know what that would look like yet. But I had a feeling that it was going to be the most important thing I'd ever do. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Ryan. But this time, I ignored it. He was part of the past now, and I had no intention of going back. The storm had passed. Now, it was time for the calm. Weeks passed, and the dust from the storm I had set in motion began to settle. In many ways, it felt like I had entered a new chapter of my life, a chapter that was no longer bound by the expectations of my family, no longer influenced by their views of who I should be. I had done what I had set out to do, expose the cracks in their perfect facade. And in doing so, I had freed myself from the invisible chains they had wrapped around me for so long. But freedom, as it often does, came with its own set of complications. My family's dysfunction was no longer a source of subtle frustration, it had become a gaping wound. The distance between my parents and me was palpable. My father, once the pillar of authority in our household, had retreated into a quiet corner of his life. I rarely saw him anymore, and when we did cross paths, the silence between us was heavy, suffocating. My mother, on the other hand, had tried every tactic in the book to salvage what was left of our relationship. She'd called me multiple times, sending texts that ranged from pleading to angry. But I had learned the hard way that her attempts to manipulate the narrative were as hollow as the life she had spent years constructing. I wasn't interested in playing her game anymore. I had stopped answering her calls weeks ago. Ryan, despite his apology, hadn't let up. He tried calling, leaving messages, sending emails. At first, I thought he might be genuinely seeking redemption. But after the third or fourth attempt, I realized that his motives weren't as pure as I'd originally thought. Ryan didn't just want to repair our relationship, he wanted to repair his image, to ensure that the truth of his business failure wasn't the only thing people remembered about him. It became clear that Ryan wasn't looking for a true connection, he was looking for a way to wipe the slate clean. And that's when I realized something important. This entire ordeal wasn't just about me getting my revenge on them. It wasn't even about proving them wrong. It was about something deeper, something far more personal. For the first time in my life, I was forced to face myself, not as the family disappointment, but as a person who was finally in control of his own destiny. I didn't need their approval anymore, didn't need their validation. The years of trying to fit into their mold had taken a toll on me, and now it was time to reshape my own identity, free from their expectations. The transition wasn't immediate. Healing rarely is. It wasn't like I woke up one day and everything clicked into place. But little by little, I started to understand what it meant to live for myself. The small, mundane tasks that had once felt meaningless now felt like markers of my independence. I started taking better care of my body, eating healthier, getting back into the hobbies I had abandoned in my younger years, like painting and reading books just for the pleasure of it. I also began to build a life outside the shadows of my family. I reconnected with old friends, people I hadn't seen in years because I'd been too caught up in the toxic pull of my family dynamics. They reminded me of who I used to be before I had allowed myself to become defined by other people's opinions. I found a new sense of purpose in my work, and for the first time in a long time, I felt proud of what I was accomplishing on my own terms. And then, out of nowhere, a message came in. It was from my mother. She was at the bottom of the stairs, staring at her phone, her finger hovering over the send button. I had to smile at the thought, her unrelenting drive to push and manipulate even when she had no ground to stand on. The message was simple but devastating in its honesty. Jake, I know I've failed you. I know I haven't been the mother you needed. But I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. The words sat there, hanging in the air between us. I could feel the weight of everything she had said, all the years of manipulation, of conditioning, of trying to control my life. I could feel the quiet desperation in her voice, the realization that her perfect world was gone, and that she was now facing the consequences of her own actions. But that wasn't why I smiled. It was the first time in my life that I felt like I was in control of my own decisions, my own emotions. And this time, there was no rush to respond, no urgency to placate her, no need to play the role she had cast for me. I could take my time. I didn't respond to her message immediately. Instead, I left it unread. I knew that the time would come for us to talk. But not yet. I had rebuilt my life, and it had nothing to do with her, or with any of them. In the weeks that followed, my life began to stabilize, and for the first time, I felt the satisfaction of knowing I had control over my own story. I spent more time reflecting, thinking about who I was and who I wanted to become. I realized that in a strange way, I owed my family something. They had pushed me to a breaking point, and it was only because of their cruelty, their constant need to tear me down, that I had found the strength to rebuild myself from the ground up. For all their faults, for all the damage they had done, I had learned something valuable in the process. The only person who can truly define you is yourself. And no matter how hard they tried to make me feel small, I had proven that I was capable of far more than they ever gave me credit for. But even as my life grew more stable, I knew there was one final step left. One final conversation I needed to have. The next family gathering was around the corner. My parents had invited me, of course they had, but this time, I wasn't going to walk into the lion's den like I had done before. I was going to walk in with my head held high, knowing that I had nothing left to prove to them. The stage was set. It would be the last time I allowed them to make me feel small. And this time, I was going to take the final step in my transformation, by confronting them face to face. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain, I was no longer their punching bag. The power had shifted. And I was in control. The invitation came at the most predictable of times. Of course, they had to try again. My parents, desperate to restore the illusion of unity, had called another family gathering. It was their way of attempting to patch the cracks I had exposed in their pristine facade. But this time, it wasn't going to be the same. This wasn't going to be a quiet dinner where I bit my tongue and nodded politely to every insult they threw my way. No, this time, I had already taken control. I had the upper hand, and they were going to face the consequences of their actions, whether they liked it or not. The dinner was set for a Sunday evening, just as it always had been when we were kids, a family tradition, or at least, that's what my mother had always called it. And just like every other family event, I knew exactly what to expect. The forced pleasantries, the uncomfortable glances exchanged behind my back, the subtle digs and passive-aggressive comments. But this time, it was different. I wasn't the same person I had been the last time we all sat around this table. As the day drew closer, I realized something profound. This dinner wasn't just about confrontation. It wasn't about humiliating them or extracting an apology that I knew I would never get. This dinner was about me. It was about me taking the final step in reclaiming my life. It was about setting boundaries, making it clear to them, and to myself, that I was no longer under their thumb. This time, I was going to take control of the situation in a way I never had before. I arrived early, just as I had promised. My parents were already in the kitchen, my mother bustling around with a false smile plastered on her face, pretending like everything was perfectly normal. She greeted me with that overly cheerful tone of hers, the one she always used when she was trying to pretend everything was fine. "Jake, darling, it's so good to see you," she exclaimed, her voice a little too high-pitched, a little too rehearsed. "Dinner's almost ready, just give me a few more minutes." I nodded, smiling back politely, but there was no warmth in it. The warmth I had once felt for them, the yearning for their approval, had long since burned out. It was replaced by something much more powerful, indifference. And I wasn't going to hide that anymore. As my mother scurried around, I looked over at my father, who was sitting at the kitchen table, his face drawn, his hands trembling slightly as he fidgeted with his glass of water. He didn't say anything. He knew what was coming. And yet, despite everything, there was still a part of me that almost felt sorry for him. He was just a man, after all, trapped by the same illusions that had kept me in line for so long. Ryan showed up shortly after, looking disheveled, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by a deep sense of unease. His eyes darted nervously around the room, and he barely met my gaze. I could see the strain in his face, the way he was trying to put on a brave front, but the cracks were clear. He was a fraud, and he knew it. But what was most telling was the way he avoided the topic of the business failure. He wanted everything to go back to normal, to pretend like nothing had happened. But there was no going back for me. I had already moved on, and I wasn't going to sit at their table pretending like we could just pick up where we left off. The years of manipulation, the subtle jabs, the constant belittling, it was all behind me now. I was no longer the failure they had tried to make me believe I was. I was no longer defined by their expectations. Dinner started, and the conversation, as expected, remained painfully strained. My mother tried to steer it toward neutral topics, family vacations, the weather, Ryan's latest business ventures, but every word that came out of her mouth felt like a thinly veiled attempt at smoothing things over. Every time Ryan spoke, his voice faltered, and I could see the fear behind his words. He knew he couldn't hide behind his charm anymore. The truth had caught up with him. But I remained quiet. I didn't feel the need to jump into the conversation. I wasn't there to play the part of the dutiful son anymore. I was there for something bigger. After a few minutes, I leaned back in my chair, eyes scanning the table. My parents, despite their outward attempts at normalcy, were falling apart. And Ryan, well, he was just waiting for the storm to hit, hoping somehow I would spare him the fallout. But that wasn't going to happen. Finally, I spoke. "You know," I began, my voice cutting through the tense silence, "I've been thinking a lot about all of this. About how we've tried to pretend that everything's fine, like nothing's really changed. But the truth is, we're not the same people we used to be. We're not the same family. And I think we all need to face that." My mother froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand instinctively reaching for his water glass. My father looked down at the table, as though the weight of my words had physically struck him. "What are you talking about, Jake?" my mother asked, trying to sound calm, but her voice betraying her anxiety. "What's this about? We're still family." I smiled thinly. "No, Mom. Not anymore. Not in the way you want it to be. You've spent so many years pushing me to be something I'm not, and for once, I'm standing here, saying no. I'm not going to pretend anymore." Ryan looked up, his expression unreadable. "What do you want from us, Jake?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to him slowly, meeting his gaze. "I want nothing from you, Ryan. Not anymore. I'm not your punching bag, and I'm not your scapegoat. I'm done being the family disappointment. And I'm done pretending like everything you've done to me doesn't matter." There was silence in the room again. But this time, it wasn't just awkward, it was heavy, like something had shifted in the air, something irreversible. My father finally spoke, his voice low and tired. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Jake. We thought we were doing what was best for you." I nodded slowly, the anger in me starting to settle into something colder, more final. "You thought you were doing what was best for me. But you never asked me what I wanted, did you? You never bothered to listen." The silence that followed was suffocating. My parents, despite their attempts to salvage the situation, knew it was over. I had taken the last piece of their perfect world and shattered it. And they knew that there was no going back from here. Ryan stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't do this," he muttered, before turning and walking out of the room. And just like that, the final domino fell. The family was no longer the same. Ryan was gone, retreating into the shadows of his own failure. My parents sat there, stunned, realizing that the perfect family they had so carefully constructed had crumbled before them. And I, for the first time in years, felt free. The power had shifted. I had played the long game, and I had come out on top. No more pretending. No more appeasing. No more being the family disappointment. I was done. And this time, it was for good. The dust settled in the days following the dinner. I had said what I needed to say. The air between my parents and me was no longer just thick with tension, it was suffocating, and I knew there was no point in trying to breathe life back into something that had long since died. Ryan's departure from the house had been the final nail in the coffin. He hadn't come back, and I didn't expect him to. I was no longer the punching bag of this family. I wasn't the one who was supposed to endure their jabs in silence. No, I had stopped being their target. The power had shifted, and for the first time in my life, I could finally breathe without the weight of their expectations crushing me. But there was a strange quietness that came after the storm. It wasn't just the absence of my brother's arrogance or my parents' distant attempts to salvage the family image. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. I had spent so many years bending to their will, keeping my head down and playing the role they wanted for me, that now, without them, I had to figure out who I really was. Who I wanted to be. The relief was palpable, but there was an emptiness that followed. No longer defined by their disapproving eyes or their ever-looming expectations, I found myself standing in a space where the future was wide open. And the strange thing about freedom was that it came with both excitement and terror. I took time to reflect. I revisited the old version of myself, the one who was always trying to prove himself, always desperate for their approval. It wasn't that I hadn't loved them, or that I didn't care about family. I did. But the truth was, the longer I fought for their love, the more I lost myself in the process. Their idea of love had been conditional, their approval given only when I met their standard. But no more. In the days after that final dinner, I began to build something new. A life where I was the architect of my own future. I started by reintroducing the things I had left behind. Hobbies that used to bring me joy, but which had been overshadowed by the weight of my family's expectations. I rediscovered my love of painting, even though I had long ago told myself that it was a childish pastime, one that didn't align with the important things in life. But now, I found solace in it. Each brushstroke, each canvas, felt like a small rebellion, a declaration that I was still here, still capable of creating beauty in a world that had tried to strip me of my identity. But the real change came in how I viewed relationships, not just with my family, but with the people around me. For the first time in my life, I started seeking relationships that didn't come with strings attached. I met people who didn't judge me by my last name or my family's expectations. I was finally able to show up as my true self, without apology or the need for validation. I reconnected with old friends, and the friendships were different now. They were real, unencumbered by the past. They weren't based on the roles I was supposed to play, but on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine connection. They didn't know the old Jake, the one who had been trapped by his family's demands. They only knew the new Jake, the one who had found his own way. But it wasn't just in the small, everyday moments that I found my freedom, it was in the bigger decisions, too. I decided to leave the job I had been in for years. The one that, despite paying well, had kept me tethered to a routine I had long grown tired of. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do next, but I knew it wasn't that. It was scary, walking away from something stable, something my parents had always encouraged me to hold on to. But in a strange way, it felt liberating. The idea that I could walk away, that I could choose my own path without fear of judgment, was a new kind of power. A few weeks later, I enrolled in a class on creative writing. Writing had always been a dream of mine, one that I had buried under the weight of responsibilities and obligations I had never chosen for myself. But now, with the chains of my family's expectations broken, I could explore that side of me. It was humbling, entering a class full of people who had no idea who I was, who didn't care about my family's drama or my history. They simply cared about the words I put on the page. And for the first time, I realized that I had something valuable to offer the world, not because of my last name, or my family's reputation, but because of my own experiences. As I wrote, I began to feel a sense of healing. Each word, each sentence, was a way of reclaiming my own narrative. It was a way to rewrite the story that had been dictated to me for so long. And in that process, I started to see the future in a new light. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about proving them wrong or making them suffer. It was about me finding peace, about me being able to look in the mirror and finally see someone who was worthy of love, without the need for anyone's approval. One evening, a month or so after the dinner, I received a call from my mother. She had tried reaching out before, but I had ignored her attempts. This time, however, something was different. Her voice, when she spoke, wasn't the usual controlling, desperate tone. It was softer. There was no manipulation in it, no attempt to make me feel guilty. It was just her, vulnerable. "I don't know where we go from here, Jake," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I'm sorry for everything. For how I treated you. For not seeing you. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just wanted you to know that I regret everything." For a long time, I didn't know how to respond. I had spent so many years waiting for this moment, waiting for my parents to finally acknowledge what they had done to me. And now, here it was. But in some strange way, I didn't feel the surge of vindication I had expected. Instead, I felt relief. It wasn't an apology that healed the wounds, it was the fact that I didn't need it anymore. I had already healed on my own. "I hear you, Mom," I said quietly. "But I'm not the same person I was before. I'm not asking for an apology, and I'm not asking for anything from you. I've moved on. But I'm glad you're starting to understand." The conversation ended with no promises. No promises that we would be a family again. No promises that we could repair what had been broken. But there was a strange sense of closure in it. A sense that we could both move forward without being bound by the past. And as I hung up the phone, I realized something important: my family had never truly been in control of my life. They had only been players in a game I had chosen to play. But now, the game was over. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the cards. It was time for the next chapter. My story wasn't defined by them anymore. It was mine to tell.